All right, just watching everybody filter in. We've made it halfway through our week. So congrats everyone. We're halfway through, halfway there to the weekend, and it's just been a lovely time here in the Valley. So I'll go ahead and get started as people are still kind of trickling in. So good afternoon, happy lunchtime. I'm Allison Lester, the Associate Director of Visitor and Member Engagement, and I'm coming to you live from the Heard Museum. I'd like to welcome you to today's virtual art talk, recognizing Raffia Baskets in your collection. Now, here's just a few brief housekeeping items. It's a webinar today, which means you'll only see and hear from our panelists. The chat box is open. Just make sure you select everyone if you would like your comments to be seen by more than just me and the panelists. At the very end of the discussion, I'll come back to open the Q&A, but you're welcome to submit your questions at any time. You can do so either in the chat or through the Q&A function. We will monitor both. With the Q&A though, we typically are the only ones that'll see those questions. So just so you're aware there. And if you have any technical difficulties, I'm going to go ahead and drop this in the comment. You can always call the membership helpline. We've got one of our associates constantly monitoring. So if you have any issues, just go ahead and call, and my associate Christina can help walk you through there. And this webinar is being recorded. We will be posting this to YouTube in about a week. It takes us maybe 2 to 3 days, but at the most about a week to get it up there. So you're welcome to go back and watch this at any time. And at the conclusion of the event, we will have a brief survey for you. So we appreciate your feedback. They help us plan and facilitate the next one. So without further ado, today's discussion will be moderated by our Chief Curator, Diana Pardue. So I'm going to go ahead and turn this over to Diana, who will introduce our panelists, and I'll see everyone again at the end for the Q&A.
Allison, thank you. We're just so excited to bring this talk today and have an option to look at a view like this one. And today we're joined by Bryn Potter and Ellen Pearlstein. Bryn Potter specializes in Native American basketry. She was curator of basketry at the Autry Museum of the America West and adjunct curator of basketry at the Museum of Riverside. She works with institutions, tribes, and the California Indian Basket Weavers Association. Bryn received 2 fellowships from the Buffalo Bill Center of the West for basketry projects. She has written for American Indian Art and First American Art magazines and has been a judge at the Heard Museum Guild Indian Fair and Market. Professor Ellen Pearlstein is a founding faculty member in the graduate UCLA Getty Conservation Program, where she incorporates Indigenous instruction into the understanding and care of California basketry. Ellen is the director of the Andrew W. Mellon Opportunity for Diversity in Conservation. She is a Keck Prize awardee and a recent recipient of a Rome Prize for the study of collaborative conservation approaches to America's collections in European museums. We welcome you. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Diana, and thank you to everybody at the Heard for this great opportunity. I'm going to share my screen and begin our presentation. Oops, sorry, let me go back one. Okay, so as both Bryn and I are in Southern California, we would like to acknowledge the Gabrielino Tongva peoples as the traditional land caretakers of Tavangar, which is the Los Angeles Basin and South Channel Islands. And we pay our respects to both the past and present stewards of the lands on which we reside. So we're going to tell you this story about our combined research efforts. And this all began actually with my teaching at UCLA Getty. And as Diana kindly mentioned, I always engage my students with working with Indigenous scholars and experts and working on baskets in an Indigenous repository. And the example that I'm showing you here are my students that graduated in 2020 as young conservators, and our work that took place at the Barona Cultural Center and Museum, which is located outside of San Diego and is the Barona Band are members of the Kumeyaay tribe. And we're looking here at baskets in their collection. Oh, sorry, I've lost my, let me just once again find those arrows. Let's see if I can do this. Okay, that worked. Great. So in addition to working with members of the community and the museum experts, and also the tribal council for the Barona Band. We also have the pleasure of working with Ava Salazar, who is a master weaver, Kumeyaay weaver, and she was instructing our students in the materials, procurement, processing, and construction of coiled basketry. And you can see these images on both sides of the slide where Ava is instructing us and looking at baskets with us and helping us evaluate what we're looking at. In the case of the basket on the right-hand slide, Ava looked very resolutely at the basket that we showed her, and she said, nope, that's not ours. That basket is not ours. She said it might be Tohono O'odham, but it is not Kumeyaay. And in case you're not familiar with Ava's work, I've included here this wonderful image of Ava some years ago, showing some of her extraordinary, masterful basketry. So you can understand why we trust and are willing and eager to learn from her. So this is that very basket, and we brought it to our conservation labs at the UCLA Getty training program at the Getty Villa. And this basket was, of course, of interest to us. It was of interest to our students because of the damage, frankly, as conservators. We're always challenged by any kind of damage, and you can see the breaks in the walls and the section that's been that had been removed or released. And so we were examining this particular basket, and we always invite a whole group of experts to come and exchange with our students. In addition to our Indigenous scholars and museum staff and members, we invite other people as well, and that included none other than Bryn Potter, my co-conspirator here. And Bryn came to our labs and she looked at this basket and she said, well, that's an Indian school basket. And this was a new phrase for me. I'd not yet heard about what an Indian school basket actually is. And so I took a deep dive into starting to do research into what is this notion of an Indian school basket. And that led to these two publications, one of which is the one on the left is Indian Basket Weaving by the Navajo School of Indian Basketry. And the one on the right is How to Make Indian Baskets by the Apache School of Indian Basket Weaving. And it was very clear that, so the book on the left dates to 1903, the one on the right is roughly 1900. And these were extremely interesting to me and to Bryn as well, in terms of like, what is their source? What are the origins of these kinds of so-called schools? And where did they get the information that they were conveying in terms of instructional materials for making baskets? And that led me to interact with Irving Nelson, who was at the office of the Navajo Nation Library for 47 years. Irving is recently retired, but I was very fortunate. I ended up connecting with him in one of his last days at the museum, library, and visitor center. And Irving was very clear with me about the fact that there was absolutely no connection between the Navajo School of Basketry and the Navajo Nation. And that in roughly 1900, the Navajo were not actually actively making baskets. And also what I also learned from further research, that of course the name Navajo was appropriated very broadly and was used, if one does a search of Library of Congress titles, we find over 100 publications in 1900 that use the term Navajo, but in fact have no connection with the Navajo. And so this was sort of a setting against which we began to study these so-called school baskets. And I'm going to turn it over to Bryn at this moment, who'll continue our research.
Okay. Allison, am I up there?
Yep, we see you, Bryn, and we hear you.
Okay,
Yeah,
good.
we see and hear you.
Okay.
Now we don't see you, we only hear you, but that's okay.
Well, I don't know what happened to my,
We see and hear you now.
okay,
Yeah,
thank you. All right.
sure,
So
go
thank
ahead.
you. And thank you, Ellen, and thank you for
Sure.
Diana also. It's always a pleasure to work with Ellen and her students. And those of you who know Ellen know that she has an insatiable curiosity. So when I first mentioned to her about that Raffia basket that Ava Salazar was looking at, Ellen wanted to know, tell me more, give me references. And when I mentioned that there weren't really any references, she said, well, then let's write one. And then, of course, immediately she's back in Washington, D.C. in the archives looking things up. So our goal was to create guidelines to figure out how can you recognize these baskets and can we find the characteristics that describe them? And so our first, one of our first visits to museum collections to look at these baskets was to the Heard Museum, where we worked with curator Janet Cantley. And we spent 2 days with Janet, and she pulled out a number of baskets from the collections, and we were able to look at quite a few of them. Okay, I hope you can hear me all right. I just got a little note that says you're not hearing me. Okay, sorry. Next slide, please. Okay, these are 3 baskets from the Heard Museum collection that we looked at. And when you're looking at baskets to identify them, you look at materials and techniques first to put them in a geographical area. And then you look on to things such as, more diagnostic characteristics. So the basket on the left, first looking at it, you'll see it's kind of got an oval on the bottom. Well, that's indicative of Washoe basketry, but this is not Washoe. The sides kind of look Salish, Columbia River. This is not a Columbia River basket. The overall feel of the basket was kind of like a Yupik from Western Alaska, but this was not an Alaskan basket. To the right, you have a basket that looks a little more generic. That could be Native American. It could be Pakistani. It could be a recent import. And the tag there says North African. That's how it was originally cataloged. But again, those are incorrect. In the center, we have a great basket in the Heard collection. And this was made by Annie Kudlaluk. And Annie was an Inupiat student who was taken to the Carlisle Indian School in Pennsylvania. And she was there between 1897 and 1907. And during her time there, she created this basket, which does not look traditional North American, and it certainly does not look like an Inupiat basket. So one of the things Ellen had mentioned is they were teaching basketry in Indian schools, but also they were teaching basketry in regular public schools as part of industrial arts classes. Okay, next slide, please. Now, these 2 baskets probably look a little more Native American to you if you're familiar with basketry, and they look Maidu. And the one on the right actually is a Maidu basket. The Maidu tribe is from the Sacramento, California area. And but you look at these 2, they're similar shape, they're similar color, they're similar designs. The one on the right is made of redbud, and redbud bark is used for the design. and red bud peeled of its bark is used on the background. So again, you could be easily fooled by the basket on the left. Okay, next slide, please. Now this basket here is from the Phoebe Apperson Hearst Museum up at UC Berkeley. And at first glance, you might look at that and say, oh, that looks like a Southwestern basket. It's got that fret design, the colors are right. It looks old. It's, looks worn. It's got some patination. Maybe it's Achmelo Odom, but no, it's not. This also has some unusual fabric patches that were sewn on, and we don't really know, what those are there for. But anyway, this basket is also a raffia basket, which at the Hearst Museum, they know, and you might be able to read the little tag below. It says that they had put this basket into the category of gifts, novelties, models, fakes, and reproductions. So they know that it's not a Native American basket. And just as at the Hearst Museum, they knew that those were not Native American baskets as well. So then the question is, where did all these non-native imitative baskets come from? Okay, next slide, please. Okay, Ellen introduced us to the idea of the Navajo School of Indian Basketry and the Apache School, and I am introducing you to George Wharton James. Now, that's the fellow there in the center, and he was a Methodist minister who was also a basket collector, a prolific author, an entrepreneur, and very much a self-promoter. And his 1902 book, Indian Basketry, is a classic in the field. One of the things he did was he created on the right, The Basket. And this is a magazine. He did that for several years. He put out by the Basket Fraternity in Pasadena, California. And James, in fact, lived in Pasadena, and his personal basket collection eventually went to the Southwest Museum, which is now the Autry Museum. But more pertinent to our study is the book on the left, The Practical Basket Making. This and another book of his called How to Make Indian Basketry give us more clues to this basket phenomenon. What he did was he wrote these books and gave guidelines on how to make baskets. So you could be a non-native, you could just be a hobbyist who wants to make baskets. Well, you could purchase his books and learn how to do that. And he also sold all of the materials necessary to make your baskets. Again, he was a promoter. He wanted to put these things right out there. And he also had the idea that if you made these baskets at home, it would be less expensive than going out and buying native baskets. But in fact, native people oftentimes making basketry was their livelihood. So we really don't know the economic impact of making your own baskets versus purchasing them from native people. Okay, next slide, please. Sorry. Now, if you didn't want to buy a book and make a basket, we found that you could purchase a kit. And in fact, this is a kit that was produced by the Navajo School of Basketry in Los Angeles, California. And it's part of the Southwest Museum collection at the Autry Museum of the American West. And what came in this kit? In the bottom right, we can see a picture of the little instructional booklet. And above that is a bundle of raffia. And raffia is a non-North American plant material that was used for sewing the stitches. And those stitches are called the weft material. The bottom shows little pieces of raffia of various colors. And these colored pieces show, they're dyed, and you could buy these different colors. So they sent you this little sample in case you wanted to contact them and buy additional material. Now in the center, in the center we have a bundle of rattan, and that material is used as the foundation or the warp in a basket. But most importantly in this kit, we have a basket start, and that is on the left. When you're making a basket, one of the most difficult things is beginning your basket. And the center of a basket where you begin is actually called the basket start. And you can see that here. That bundle in the section, the piece of rattan from the center would be soaked and made pliable, and then it would be bent over and it would be stitched into place with the raffia. And as you stitch, you are sewing the coils to itself and your basket progresses in size. So by providing this start in the kit, that ensures that, well, maybe people will get past this difficult part and they will go ahead and start their basket, they'll finish their basket, and then they'll buy another kit. So what we've been interested in is, where did these basket starts come from? Who is producing them for the kits? And we have not been able to figure that out. Now, if you happen to have one of these in your collection, or if anybody's aware of any of these in museums, we would really be interested in finding out more about that, and you could contact us. Okay, thank you. Next slide, please. Okay, now these are paper models of basketry. These are fold out papers that would be included in these basket instructional books. And these are made by the Navajo School of Indian Basketry, but George Wharton James also had his own set of basket models. And for those of you familiar with basketry, you can see that there are a lot of basket types represented here. So you could make baskets from numerous tribes. For instance, the one on the lower left, that's a Central California basket, a very distinctive design. Maybe that's a North Fork Mono basket even. The center top, that long basket, is a classic pomo canoe shaped basket. And the two on the right, that's the bottom view and the side view of a bottleneck basket. And the shape is described as a bottleneck. That type of basket was made in Central California from the southern San Joaquin Valley across to the Death Valley. So Yokuts, Panamint, a number of different tribes made this shape of basket. But these are very instructional diagrams. And if you were making a basket, you could look at the one on the top, which is in fact that flat disc. That's a view of the base of the basket. If you were weaving, you would actually be able to count those rows and see where you needed to finish your base and start going up the sides. So again, these were very instructional diagrams. And you could also see with the variety of tribal basketry represented, that baskets imitative of many styles could be made by a competent weaver, even if that's just a hobbyist working at home with raffia. Okay, next slide, please. Now, these are baskets from the Riverside Museum of Riverside in Riverside, California, and we have a history on all of them. The ones on the right are from Miss Jessie Hooker, and Jessie Hooker was a Riverside socialite, and she had ties to Sherman Indian High School, and we read about that in some of the vintage papers. And she made some very fine baskets. She left her estate to the First Methodist Church of Riverside, and then the baskets came to the museum. And so we speculate, could she have known George Wharton James? He was in Pasadena, that's 50 miles from Riverside. And Riverside and Pasadena in the early 1900s were very wealthy cities, and they were cultural influencers. So it's possible that she knew him. Now on the left, this was made by Ann North, another Riverside socialite. In fact, she was the wife of John North, who was the founder of the city of Riverside. And museum records tell us that she did in fact know George Wharton James. And a little bit more on the three baskets on the right, the Jessie Hooker baskets. Those look like they could be typical Southern California baskets. The color is right for them, and the shape and design are kind of typical of Cahuilla basketry, or of the mission tribes like Ipai, Pion Cowicham, other Southern California groups. The background material, the light raffia, looks like it could be sumac, which is their traditional material used, and that orange looks like it could be juncus, which was used. Okay, next slide, please. Ann North's basket looks like it could be Southwestern. It's got that great fret design. It's got a fancy rim finish. It's braided or herringbone like a Paiute or Navajo basket. It's very well made. It has even stitching. You know, that really could fool a museum, that could fool a collector. To the right, we have a sample or a illustration from a book of what could be this basket. It's possible that she used this book as her guideline. And above that basket in the photo, we have a little diagram. Again, this shows how you make your basket. Those 3 vertical pieces are the warp or the foundation. And it shows how you're taking your raffia and it with a needle and wrapping that foundation and then stitching it into a coil. And I think I forgot to mention that needles were also included in that basketry kit, because when you're using raffia, it's a thin thread-like material and you need to stitch it with a needle. With traditional basketry, the materials you had were much heavier. Think about willow as a tree. In California, your sumac is a bush, juncus is a reed. They're thicker and heavier, and needles were never used. What was used instead was the weaver would take an awl and poke a hole in the coil of the basket, and then with her hand thread the stitch material through. And so needles were not used in traditional basketry, but they're almost always used in raffia basketry. Okay, next slide, please. So here are a few more raffia baskets that, you know, can easily fool people. On the left, the one with the green design, that's from the Hearst Museum up in Berkeley again. And you see the dye and you might think, oh, perhaps dye is a clue to these imitative baskets. And it's not necessarily, because think of Hopi baskets. Aniline dyes, commercial dyes have been available since the late 1800s in basketry. But it is something that can be considered. The 2 photos, or the photo of the 2 baskets in the center, the one to the left could be an Apache Oya. The one to the right could be a California basket cap. But no, the caption tells us that Miss Nellie Sutton of Michigan actually made those baskets. So again, those are imitative of native baskets, but they're made of raffia. Now over to the right, that black and white picture, the one with the bee and the star, that shows a basket of raffia with a raffia foundation. Now most of the baskets that we studied had the rattan rod foundation, but we did see a couple with a raffia bundle foundation. And in fact, this photo, color photo just to the left of the bee, is one of those baskets. And at first glance, you might look at it and say, oh, that could be a Hopi basket. It's got nice fat coils. Or, oh, that could be a Kauai basket. That looks like sumac and juncus. And you could look a little closer and you would see that it has a bundle foundation, which for the Hopi would be made of galenta grass. For the Kauai would be made of deer grass. But if you really looked closer, you would see that, oh no, it's a raffia bundle and these are raffia stitches. So this again is an imitative basket. Okay, so now I'm going to turn this back to Ellen to share more about the material characteristics of raffia basketry.
So unmute myself. Thank you, Bryn. So in addition to looking at the kind of styles of the baskets, the sources for the baskets, and the instructional materials that are available for these baskets, we were wondering whether or not we could translate some of what we had learned about the designs and the instructions and actually look for evidence, physical evidence in the baskets themselves. So this is a basket on the left that Bryn has already shown. One of the diagnostics I thought would be interesting to look for would be to see whether we could ever see evidence of a prepared start that had been made by somebody else and had been provided, and then where the subsequent work was done by the home weaver, the non-Indigenous weaver. And so we looked for differences in the tension or the quality of stitching between the start and the subsequent stitch work. And in this particular basket at the herd, we do see that there's a distinction between the start and the subsequent stitches. And I've done a, sorry, I'm having a terrible time finding the arrows for advancing. There we go. Okay, so now you can see I've outlined in the image on the right where that distinction actually occurs. So we do see this separating gap between the start and the subsequent stitches, but we don't really, this did not turn out to be a widespread feature that was detectable. And also the stitch work seems actually fairly uniform between this start and the subsequent stitching. So this was something we looked for, but dismissed. Other evidence that we looked for that we did see quite many examples that supported this kind of evidence was that we would see in these imitative baskets, such as the one on the right from the Phoebe Hearst Museum, we would see that the rims were very often finished with a solid color, a contrasting dark solid color, which was not something that we would necessarily see on indigenous basketry. So, we're just showing you here the contrast between this Yokuts bottleneck basket on the left and this basket in the Hearst Museum that we were convinced is an imitative basket on the right, also a bottleneck. Another feature that we saw very often was the use of these interlocking stitches. So we saw a lot of use made where the stitching elements would not be wrapped around every one of the foundation. There would be a gap between the next stitch that captured the next row of foundation, and it would create this kind of offset pattern that you see, I think, pretty prevalently on this basket on the right. We also saw a lot of irregularity in the walls of these imitative baskets. So I hope you can kind of see that in the basket on the right, there are foundation elements that protrude out and others that are more recessed, creating a much less striking and precise profile, such as you see in the basket on the left. An additional feature that we observed was that there was frequently a poor or a kind of a challenge to the weaver in finishing off the basket. And what that would result in would be baskets where the rim elements were not solidly connected to the walls below them. And so we would very often see where the rim elements on these imitative baskets would become detached because the completion of the rim was not completely secure. And so in this example, again, another example from the Hearst Museum on the left, you can see that the rim has become detached. And then we also caught this screen grab of a auction record promoting a basket that is neither 1800s nor Pomo. However, it is one of these raffia baskets that is being offered for sale, and in keeping with what I've just described, the rim is pretty much detaching itself from the remainder of the basket. A close examination of the materials was particularly interesting to me, and I wanted to point out to our audience that the use of this rattan material as the foundation element, as Bryn described, is actually extremely detectable through close examination of the cross-section or break edges of this material. So this material, rattan, is a stem material that comes from a group of palm trees that grow in Africa and in South America and in parts of Asia. And it's actually a very commercially viable material because these stems are exactly the right diameter and are a very long length. And so they don't need that much processing to be proffered by people for use in basketry. And what's particularly evident in the cross section are what are known as vascular bundles. So that is this series of vessels that you see, vessel openings that you see in each of these images. And these are used for water transmission in the growing plant. And you would not ever see these in woody stem materials like willow or sumac, or you would see a different format of vascular bundles in other grasses like deer grass, but it would not have this particular appearance. And in the lower right, I'm actually showing you the basket that came to us from the Verona Museum that was so roundly rejected by Ava as being of Kumeyaay origin. And so you can see, I hope, those characteristics. Another characteristic that I hope you can see on the left-hand image is that there's a kind of a parallel striation or parallel grooving on the sides of the raffia stems, rattan stems, I should say, because of these, they actually mirror those vascular bundles within. These are details actually moving on to the raffia or the stitching material. These two are originate from a palm, a family of palms, but these are not in fact from the stem. These are from the leaves. So these are leaf fiber or leaflet fiber, and they are very, their constitution is very open and loose, and they are very, very readily split into more narrow elements, and in fact even typically project thread-like elements projecting off of the leaf fiber itself. And I think you can see on the left some examples of that splitting, and those very pronounced elements that are sticking up are kind of shredding apart a bit. And the other thing that is noteworthy is that a lot of the weavers, in working with raffia fiber, would twist it to keep it cohesive for placing through a needle to do the methods of stitching that Bryn has already described. So you can often see a lot of this kind of twisting in the individual stitches, which I hope you can also see in the image on the left. The image on the right is, the lower right, is actually, again, the basket from Verona. And it shows you that, first of all, the rim, which is devoid of stitches at this point, is showing that kind of ridged topography that we tend to see in rattan due to the vascular bundles within it. But also, I think it's important to point out here that once these baskets are over 100 years old, which many of them are, that the basket begins to assume this kind of patina or alteration to its surface, a kind of a darkening, and also the knocking off of all of these characteristic thread-like elements that project off of the raffia fibers, so that it's understandable that these baskets can become more confusing the older they get, and as they're acquired by museums with different areas of knowledge and expertise. So I also wanted to point out that, one of our areas of interest was, how did these baskets get into collections? How is it that they ended up in museum collections? So this is a paper label that was kept by the registrar at the Hearst Museum. And this was for a basket that was bought from Annie Dick, who in Clear Lake, Lower Clear Lake, and it was a Pomo storage basket. And what I'm pointing out to you here is the accession number that's associated with this basket, which is 838. And when we trace the records at the Hearst Museum, through the generosity of their registrar, we found out that a whole group of baskets that we were looking at also came from accession 838. And this is the memorial collection in memory of Mrs. Grace Blair Depew. And Grace Blair Depew was an amazing collector of indigenous baskets. And she, the collection that was received by the Hearst included many, many, many wonderful baskets, such as the one by Annie Dick, but it also included a whole group of baskets made by non-Indian female hobbyists for recreation. And you can see this was pre-1943, so that we found actually that many of the hobbyist baskets or Indian school baskets or category file code 5.7 fakes, reproductions, etc., came into collections as part of collections of really, really remarkable indigenous baskets. So something that is quite interesting, I think. And in fact, Diana Pardue, who kindly introduced us, also provided us with registrarial records for some of the baskets that we were looking at. And in fact, we learned through that information that those baskets, those raffia baskets, were part of the Fred Harvey collection. And as we know, the Fred Harvey collection is also, a fairly famous collection of amazing indigenous baskets, but nonetheless, there occurred amongst them some of these baskets that were very likely not made from indigenous hands. And we feature here Diana's work as well. So Bryn has mentioned previously that, that these how-to basketry books were distributed amongst schools, across the country. And we know from George Wharton James's archives that he had correspondence advocating for the purchase of his books at some of the Indian boarding schools. And we don't know exactly which Indian boarding schools actually purchased his how-to materials. However, George Wharton James was extremely entrepreneurial, and his records really do show that. And this is an example of another basket from the Museum of Riverside, well-documented basket that was made by Violet Digaste at the Fort Apache Indian School while she was there. And this is a very European style basket, even though Violet was indigenous. But this is a very European style basket that could also have been made according to instructions provided by George Wharton James. And this is a basket made of rattan. It's a twined basket, not a coiled basket, but it's a twined rattan basket with a raffia, multicolored raffia trim on it. And this also got us interested in the fact that these how-to books were infiltrating Indian boarding schools. And that led to a conversation with Rosalie Talahongva, who is the curator at the Phoenix Indian School, and whose grandmother attended the Phoenix Indian School. And in our conversation with, and actually we have Janet Cantley at the Herd to thank for this connection. And I want to move straight to the kind of information that Rosalie was willing to share with us. She told us, my maternal grandmother was from First Mesa. The Hopi is a matrilineal tribe. My grandmother would not have made baskets. In fact, in traditional Hopi, it's frowned upon to make something that's not in your birthright. Her grandmother was away for 10 years at the Phoenix Indian High School. During her time away from her community, she was not learning appropriate skills associated with her village, clan, and family. She was taught to weave at school. When she went home and showed her baskets, the family was mortified. What are you doing? This is not acceptable. The baskets were torn apart by her family. There are ramifications for this. No, we do not do this. So this is another potentially unintended, but nonetheless impactful aspect of these how-to books that were propagated. Bryn has already mentioned the fact that non-Indigenous women were being advocated to purchase these how-to books and make their own baskets, and in fact deny Indigenous weavers from the income for having their own baskets purchased. In any case, just going full circle to this notion of the American Indian boarding schools, we want to just do a shout out to the amazing exhibition at the Heard Museum, because it does talk about all the highly appropriative aspects of sending children to Indian boarding schools. However, as we move to close, I do want to point out that, you know, it's not just the material, right? It's never just the material, and it's always the context that allows us to evaluate baskets, whether they are, you know, Indigenous or imitative. And just to use as an example, I mean, these are two baskets that are incorporating Raphia and Reed. And Reed is another term, by the way, for rattan or cane, also known as cane, has the same origin. And so these are two baskets made by Carol Amarthley Douglas, who is Indigenous. And the basket on the left was recently awarded second place for baskets at the Heard Museum Guild Indian Market. And Carol Amarthley Douglas is actually being lauded for her introduction, her innovative introduction of these quote unquote new materials into her baskets. And so it's really quite amazing. I mean, in some ways we've come full circle and we see this material that had one set of characteristics in one context and a very different set of characteristics now. And with that, we'd really like to thank you. And here are both of our email addresses in case people want to contact us further, and also some references to books and materials that we consulted, but also things we've recently published, both Bryn and I, about this project. And with that, I will stop sharing.
Oh, thank you so much. That was fascinating. And for those of us who have worked with some of these mystery baskets through the years, this really offers some information. I just wanted to share, and I don't recall, Ellen and Bryn, if I shared this previously, but the Fred Harvey Company bought huge basket collections from private collectors. And so we have an explanation in part for how some of those things came to the Heard, and others, you know, came from individuals and bits and pieces. And, you know, you can look at these materials and try to discern what they are, but actually both of you have trained eyes. And I think at a glance, sometimes it's not that easy. It just looks a little different and maybe doesn't look quite right, but and certainly that close examination of the foundation fibers was really, really interesting. And I thought about George Wharton James because he, as you said, he was really an entrepreneur. He sold amazingly wonderful baskets in addition to selling the kits and selling to schools. So it sounds like he just had these different tiers of sales. Is there anything else that you could tell us about George Wharton James, perhaps, that would shed light on why he would even do this? Was it just that this was the arts and crafts sort of time where baskets were one of these art forms that was so treasured?
Well, I can start and
Yeah,
then
go ahead, Ellen.
if that's okay, Bryn. I took a very deep dive into, into the life of George Wharton James, and I found out that he had archives like really all over the place and was able to access them, which was really interesting. And there have been a few books written about him as well, a dissertation. And anyway, so he came from England actually to the United States and was fairly impoverished. And interestingly, his father was a craftsman. His father was a barrel maker. And so George Wharton James had he had a real genuine respect for craft, and which was kind of wonderful, but he also was never had enough financial means, and he moved to New York, and then he moved to, I think it was Chicago, and then he moved to the Southwest because he needed, for health reasons, it was that kind of the better air and the desert air. He needed the desert air. And I think he actually was genuinely enthralled with indigenous basketry and the craftsmanship. And, I think he had a real admiration. And he has a huge photo archive. He just kept, as you already know, Diana, he kept huge, numbers of photographs of people working. And the thing is that I just think that it was for him, it was almost paying homage to be able to sell these books and kits and allow people to kind of make their own. I think for him, it was both entrepreneurial, but also a kind of homage that he was paying to these people. And it was decidedly the case that there were advertisements for purchasing these how-to materials that definitely talked about kind of you're being in a different kind of financial bracket, and you could afford these, so even you could have, these. So you may be right that it was multiple tiers. Yeah.
Yeah, I just wanted to add that James was a collector himself as well as a dealer. And when his collection wound up at the Southwest Museum, now part of the Autry, he had fascinating baskets because not only did he pick these beautiful ones, which he did, and then he sold, but his collection is full of these wonderful ethnographic pieces. In fact, one of my favorite pieces of his in the collection is a Havasupai water bottle, but it's dual lobed. So it's like a double bottle. So he has some fascinating pieces. So he held on to those because I think he was just interested in them, as well as, having these fantastic baskets that he then sold.
I think it's amazing that you found those brochures, those rather obscure brochures. And can you tell us a little bit, just for me, and then I'll turn it over to Allison because I know she has some questions. Where were those? How did you find them?
Well, the Basket Fraternity magazine, you can actually get online and you can buy those Hatha reprints of that. So those are available, but Ellen did some more archival searches for the other materials.
The models were actually folded up into a copy of the Navajo school book that's held in the special collections at the Getty. Mm-hmm. And so that was really just a wonderful thing to fall on. Yeah. I mean, to seek out and then fall on. But as Bryn said, if you have a subscription to Hathi Trust, HATHI Trust, it's which I somehow have it through my university library. One can download a lot of some of these early materials electronically, which is great. Yeah, as Bryn said.
Well, this was fascinating. Thank you so much. I know I just learned a lot. Allison, did we have any questions from any?
Yes, sorry, I can't, my AirPod went out momentarily, so sorry about that. Yeah, we had a couple questions, and certainly if you do have burning questions, now is the time to submit it. One question was about the Shumash Tribe of coastal California between Malibu up to San Luis Obispo. Did they make any baskets, and do you have any information on that, or any way to like kind of help direct people to more information about that?
Yeah, there's quite a bit of information on them. They made baskets and are still making baskets. Travis Hudson wrote about them. He is a past curator in Santa Barbara Museum. Jan Timbrook is another person who has written extensively on Shumash basketry. The Santa Barbara Museum of Natural History has the largest collection of Shumash basketry. And hopefully next year, the Santa Ynez Shumash Tribe will be opening their museum. That museum is under construction now, and they've got a fantastic collection of baskets that they will be showing there. So there is a lot of information on Shumash basketry.
Great, thank you. And then I just have one other question about, baskets made by, if it's an indigenous made basket, is it by definition a quote unquote Indian basket? And just talking through that terminology and relating that to kind of those kits and things.
Well,
I mean,
yeah, go ahead.
well, so the reference to Indian school, I think is, and Bryn, correct me if I'm wrong about this, but it does seem to be that it derives from these non-indigenous baskets. It's a term that was developed to refer to these definitely non-indigenous baskets. So so I don't know if that's clarifying, and it seems to be based on, again, the Navajo school, the Apache school, and that terminology.
Yeah, and also if you are indigenous, if you are a Native American person making a basket, whether you're making a basket from a kit or if you're making a basket from raffia, as we saw Carol Douglas basket, if the artist is Native, then yes, it is a Native basket. So hopefully that adds a little to Ellen's. I hope that answers the question.
No, I think so too. And then just one final note. I have one from Janet, actually. Is the violet Digaste basket from Fort Apache Indian School at the Fort Apache Cultural Center?
No, it's actually in the Museum of Riverside in Riverside, California. And they also have another basket by a named student from that school.
And just one final question. How did the Raffia material differ from the material used differ from the Madagascar Raffia? I hope I'm understanding that question correctly. Sorry.
Madagascar is just one of the source locations for Raffia. So Raffia was, we know that back in 1900, there was already a very robust commercial industry for importing these materials into the United States. And so, I think most people would not necessarily know the source of their raffia when they use it, but that is just one of the places, one of the origins. Yeah.
Well, great. Thank you so much. I think that about wraps it up for us. And thank you again for the wonderful discussion. I definitely learned quite a bit, as Diana mentioned, and look forward to kind of delving deeper into some of your other research. And like I mentioned at the beginning of the webinar, this will be posted to our YouTube channel in the next few days, up to about a week. So definitely, if you wanted to look back at those resources, that'll be up online and you can check them out there. So. Well, thank you both. I really appreciate you spending your time with us this afternoon, and hope you have a wonderful rest of your day. And thank you so much.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye.
Bye. way.